Okay. I'm Ellen Eggers, and I'm a retired Deputy State Public Defender. I represented men on death row for 24 years and just retired in December, and have done a lot of speaking against the death penalty.
I'm Jeff Uppington. I'm an anesthesiologist from UC Davis Medical Center in Sacramento. I'm not an expert in death penalty law, but anesthesiologists only became involved approximately 10 years ago when there was a moratorium on capital punishment in California, and one of the judges said it could go ahead as long as there was a trained practitioner in the death chamber in order to ensure that it all went well, the prisoner was actually asleep, and that if anything went wrong, it could fix it. That's how I felt about it. Not because I did any of that, but actually because I wanted to.
My name is Floyd Feeney. I teach at the law school. My fields are criminal justice and election law, and I've had a long-term interest in the death penalty because of the connection to criminal justice.
My name is McComb. I am also a Deputy State Public Defender in the Office of the State Public Defender. I've been representing men on death row for 23 years. I think the reason they asked me to come tonight is because of my caseload, I've developed somewhat some knowledge about mental health and mental illness and the execution of mental
I'm Father Michael Kiernan. I've been a pastor here in the area, Sacramento area general for over 40 years. Been very involved as director of Catholic Charities and also social justice ministries. And so I guess I've been invited here because I could speak from the perspective of Christianity in general, but specifically Catholicism in regard to our position that the death penalty is not acceptable theologically as well as unacceptable practically.
All right, so to start out, sort of an introductory question. It's number 7 on your sheet if we're looking at it. What are the costs and benefits of death penalty, legal, biological, spiritual, or moral, and/or moral? And how does executing someone impact both the family of the perpetrator and the victim and the larger community? Why don't you raise your hand to start and then go ahead.
Well, I'll take a piece of this because it involves the impact on the victim's family members, and I was involved in a case where the victim was actually a college student, a young man, and his girlfriend were abducted at gunpoint down in Los Angeles and taken up to a field off the freeway and shot and killed. It was part of a carjacking. And it happened in 1985. And some years after that, I would say 7 or 8 years later, I found out that the victim's family had actually contacted my client, the parents of the boy. He was a 19-year-old man. And through a series of events, I eventually spent the evening with that family. They lived down in Thousand Oaks, and we spoke by phone, and eventually they invited me to come and spend the evening with them. And that's been one of the most meaningful evenings of my career, actually, because I spent so many years learning so much about my client and learning aside from the defense standpoint. So to be able to spend an evening with the victim's family was really eye-opening for me. And I'll just share a little bit about it because I think it helps to answer that question of what are the benefits of the death penalty to the family of the victim. they told me, you know, I asked them, how did you ever get to the point where you could forgive my client? Because they had sent a Christmas card saying that they forgave him, that they prayed for him, and expressed an interest in communicating with him, which they have done over the years. And I said, how did you ever get to the point where you could do that? And the mother said to me, Ellen, I didn't make the decision to forgive him to help him. I did it to help me. And they both talked about how after their son was murdered, they got involved in some victims support groups because they were trying to get some relief from their anguish. And she said, we would go to these victim support groups, but there was so much anger and venom and really just hatred being spewed out because people were in so much pain, quite naturally. And she said, we would come out of those meetings and we didn't find any peace. It just got us so upset that we felt like we had to go to the bar and get a drink. And she said, we're not even drinking people. But our nerves were just shot by those meetings. And so we kept trying to figure out a different way, and we came to the conclusion that we wanted to express our forgiveness to him, and that was to help heal us. The father in the family told me that, he said to me, people who support the death penalty are like, he compared it to a village that lives on a cliff. And the people in this village were constantly having the problem of people falling over the cliff and landing at the bottom. And he said, so the village decides we got to do something about this problem. And half the people in the village want to put an ambulance service at the bottom of the hill to pick up the victims that fall, get them to the hospital. And he said the other half of the community wants to put up a fence so that people don't fall over the cliff. And he said to me, I've concluded that people who support the death penalty are like the ones that want the ambulance service. It's too late. He said, nothing will bring back my son. My focus is I want to try to prevent another family from having to go through the pain that we went through. And so my idea was, this is again what he said, his idea was to volunteer teaching religion classes at a youth detention center in Los Angeles. He said, I don't know if I'm going to get through to anybody, but if I can get through to one young man and stop him from doing what happened to my son, then I will consider that a success. And I always remember that because they didn't always feel that way. After their child had been murdered for many years, the case did not go to trial for 5 years. It took 5 years from the murder till the trial. And the wife told me when I would come to court, initially, all I could think of is I would just imagine that I had a gun in my purse and I could walk up to him and just put a bullet between his eyes. And she said I used to fantasize about that. But she said by the time the trial was over, I didn't feel that way anymore at all. And when the jury returned the verdict of the death penalty, they all filed past the two families, both parents of the boy and the girl, and hugged them and told them, we did this for you, we did this for you. And the mother said, you know, I wanted to just tell him that's not what I want, that's not what I want, because by then she didn't want her death penalty. So I think it's an important lesson that when we read about these terrible crimes, our hearts go out to the victims. And so often you hear victims say, you know, I'll never be able to rest until he's dead, and I want him to burn in hell. And all that kind of rage and pain is understandable. But my feeling is that in the long run, over time, most people come to the conclusion that they're not going to find peace through the taking of another life, through just cold-blooded revenge. And I've really concluded that that's really what the death penalty is about at a basic level, is about revenge. So I question whether it does have value for victims' family members. And a lot of victims' family members have reached that same conclusion. There's many organizations throughout the country, and including here in California, that are victims' family members opposed to the death penalty. So anyway, I've spoken too long, and I want other people to have a chance.
Well, I'll say just a word or two about very different aspects of costs and benefits. From a systemic point of view, occasionally one of the arguments that's made in favor of the death penalty, certainly not the most important argument, but that's made in favor of the death penalty is that it's less expensive than having somebody in prison for a lifetime. And so that argument, I've never quite understood why that was a very powerful argument. But there are people for whom that is a powerful argument. One of my law school classmates and good friends became, in his later career, became the Chief Justice of North Carolina, which is the state that I grew up in. And so the justices of the North Carolina Supreme Court are elected. And my friend was elected to be a justice and then later elected to be the Chief Justice. North Carolina is a southern state. Southern states, if you look at a map of the death penalty states in the United States, the southern states are way overrepresented. I mean, they're the strongest bastion of the death penalty in the United States. North Carolina is definitely a death penalty state. My classmate was personally opposed to the death penalty right from day one. And so after he had served one term as the Chief Justice, he had to run for election a second time. And so he resigned from the court in order to campaign. And he was, even though despite his opposition to the death penalty, he was supported by most of the prosecuting attorneys in the state of North Carolina, because he's a very dynamic and very engaging person on many different levels. But so he was reelected. One of the things that he wanted to do, and which I thought was very interesting, was that he spent a certain amount of time as Chief Justice of North Carolina trying to generate money to conduct a thorough and scientifically good analysis of the economic aspects of the death penalty. What's the cost of keeping somebody in prison and going through courts, all sorts of on the one side, as opposed to the death penalty on the other side. And so he was ultimately able to do that, and there are a number of other studies of this kind that have been made in this country. And while it's certainly not a central issue, at least in my mind, what these studies suggest is that the people who argue in favor of the death penalty on the argument that it's less costly, that simply isn't the way that that's not what the data shows. So not the most important issue, but an aspect of the question.
We tie in what Alan was saying, especially in regard to people's feelings about it, and they'll feel better and they'll get closure and settled. We certainly would believe spiritually that violence begets violence, and to have peace in one's life without coming through violence, and that all life is sacred, and it's hard to see why you should kill in one place and not in another place. And so it's basically on the fact that, from our point of view, I think from a Christian understanding, God has given our life, and it's not the right of anybody else. Take away that, even though a person who obviously has done killing has done a egregious and terrible thing, and of course there's all sorts of reasons why that happens, and it's sad for sure. But that the state then doing the same thing in a way, in the long run, it's not going to solve anything, and will only make a bad situation worse. So we don't see spiritual solace coming from it.
think I can speak to the legal costs of the death penalty. One of the things I've observed over the years is that it seems impossible to enforce a death penalty and at the same time maintain the values that we have as a law-abiding society. In other words, as a liberal society, we have values of openness and transparency and rules, and it seems to me that it is impossible to enforce the death penalty and stick to those values, which I think most democratic societies hold dear. And I'll use as an example the recent fiasco in Oklahoma, where Mr. Lockett was more or less tortured to death when he was executed with a lethal injection protocol that hadn't been tested, administered by individuals who did not know how to put in a groin line and they couldn't find the vein in his arm. Before that execution, there had been a lot of litigation by Mr. Lockett's lawyers trying to get the state to reveal the protocol by which they were going to execute Mr. Lockett. In other words, they wanted to know and thought they had the right to know the contents of the drugs he was using and who and how the drugs were going to be administered. They were unsuccessful in that. But because of the pressure of the death penalty, because of the feeling, the rage that some people felt and the need that some people felt that had to be carried out, all those legal efforts were shut down and that fiasco was the direct consequence. And that, I think I could, if I went through mine, give you many examples of that. So that because we have this horrible thing that we can do, and some people think we ought to do, we end up sacrificing the values, in the case of Mr. Lockett, transparency and state accountability, which we need for our day-to-day living in the democratic.
Further comment on this question?
Did we cover all the?
I mean, if you feel you said all the things that you want.
Costs and benefits.
Well, we haven't heard much from us about the benefits.
So let's move on to the next question. How do your professional ethics influence your perspective on death penalty as doctors, lawyers, priests, etc.? What influence does that have on your perspective?
Like you, the anesthesiologist.
On the professional side, from a physician's point of view, it's quite interesting. The American Medical Association has very firm ethical views on physicians being involved in healthcare. And most specialist societies, including my own, take their lead from the National Medical Society. And that position is that it is unethical for a physician to be involved in the death penalty except under two specific conditions. And one is if the prisoner is incredibly anxious and nervous, it might be okay to give them a sedative. And that while it is unethical to declare that the prisoner is dead, it is ethical to issue that they get certificate sometimes. But that it is unethical to be involved in any other part of an execution. And the reason for that is largely is because physicians are a healing profession, and this is anything but healing. The other issue is that it puts confusion in the minds of the public, because the drugs that are commonly used are exactly the same drugs that I use every day in my daily practice. It would seem, from a professional point of view, strange, to say the least, to one day treat someone and the next day kill them. So That's the ethical position of the National Society. Having said that, there are a number of physicians who are very involved in the death penalty in different states. I got involved, as I said, because I wanted to make sure, the California Society of Anesthesiologists wanted to make sure that anesthesiologists did not ever get involved in California in the death penalty. And that's how I started speaking about it. But in other states, it is common for physicians to be involved, either placing the IVs, ensuring that, or at least rendering an opinion on whether the patient, the prisoner, is asleep. And there's another dichotomy when we start talking about something like the patient. And there was a survey recently done on physicians' attitudes that indicated that quite a number of physicians, at least those that answered the survey, and that was about 40-something% out of 900 something physicians, that anywhere from 20 to 80% of them would be comfortable being involved in different aspects. Some more direct than others. So there's a dichotomy, I think, here where the National Society has a very, very firm ethical position on physicians and the death penalty, although they have no position on whether there should or should not be a death penalty, in my own personal opinion. But the National Societies have no opinion on whether there should or should not be a death penalty. But they have very firmly said that physicians should not be involved, despite the fact that physicians are involved in different states at different levels. But there's also been debates as to whether the National Societies should or could do something about that. And they have done nothing. The problem, from a practical point of view, is that in some states it is perfectly legal for physicians to be involved. What they are doing is, in fact, perfectly legal in that particular state. So banishing them from society is probably it's hard to banish you from the society for doing this regardless of
I have a question. When you say the national, are you talking about the AMA?
Yeah.
Okay. So there isn't anything they can do if the physician violates the Hippocratic Oath and does harm. There's no penalty for that.
Well, not from the American Medical Association. I mean, there are medical boards, of course, that have the power that can punish, if you like, a physician, either by punishing them or taking away their license ultimately. But again, in the states that they're doing it is legal. And so it's hard for a medical, state board, state licensing board to say they're going to take the licensing because you just done something totally legal. It's a practical issue.
But it's not legal? Legal in the sense against the civil laws or against, because I'm just wondering, I don't know that it's illegal in California. Do you know?
It's not illegal in California for physicians to be involved. But as far as I'm aware, no physician has been involved. Physicians, and if you include dentists, from a historical point of view, have a very long relationship with California. Dr. Kiernan, for example, tried to invent what he thought was a humane method, because actually just chopping your head off with an axe usually takes a lot more than just one and although he became extremely disillusioned with the way that the French eventually used the if you include dentists, the guy who invented the electric chair was a dentist. And also, there have been a number of physicians who have given advice to states about the cocktail.
Every state that has a death penalty requires physician involvement. That in California is federal laws where physicians are part of the execution laws for the execution.
Yes, it's
not illegal. That is
no, it's yeah,
in every state it's required. But I know in medical field has taken an action against any physician in the not.
I actually wasn't aware that medical professionals were involved in executions in California, because I remember with the Morales, there was someone there but he refused to do anything. I think he was only present, and that's what stopped the Morales execution that then put everything on
well,
hold.
yes, I mean that's Morales
Was willing to do
Was willing
anything
to
more
do
than observe, I think.
Right,
That
yeah.
was my understanding. Do you remember that?
Would you mind explaining the last case?
Well,
I don't have that background.
it was just the last case that was where an execution was supposed to be carried out. I think it was 2006, I believe. So it's been a number of years ago, but he was just going to be executed, and on the night of the execution is when it stopped because there was a problem, and an anesthesiologist refused to take the next step to, I think they said, well, we don't know what will happen if X, Y, or Z, and they wanted this anesthesiologist to get involved in some way, and he said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm only here to observe. I'm not here to help the execution. So they called it off. I mean, it was like 12:30, 1 o'clock in the morning. It was about an hour after it should have taken place. And they stopped it, and then that's what led to the litigation after that, that eventually, where it was all put on hold until they could get the protocol right. And it was tied up in federal court, and it's still tied up in court today.
Although interestingly, the initial cocktail, one of the drugs is no longer available in this country, and Europeans refused to sell it to any prison service, and now an increasing number of drug companies refuse to sell drugs to prison services because it's absolutely used for execution, and they don't want to be involved or tainted with it. And that's part of what's happening now, is that people are trying to find new and different drugs.
Yeah, that's what happened in Oklahoma.
Yeah.
They weren't able to get there. That's why there was no investigation. They couldn't get the drugs they were expected to get. They resorted to one of like these compounding pharmacies, which would make your poison to match your need. But with no oversight until there was litigation about getting access to these drugs. Lawyers.
California used to be the chief medical officer of the prison, and now it's volunteers who are prison doctors who volunteer for this extra paid assignment. So they're not allowed to handle it. They volunteer. They've had no problems getting volunteers. The second paid assignment is served on this execution. All they do is pronounce the death.
Yeah, as I said, I don't think you'll find a problem. I mean, physicians are like everybody else. They have their own opinions. Some for the death penalty, some against the death penalty. Some of them may not know what the American Medical Association is doing with. Some of them may not care. And as I said, the relatively recent survey did show that a significant number of physicians would get involved. So, from an anesthesiology point of view, the state society ethical positions. No anesthesiologist should be involved in any way other than those two exceptions of the American Medical Association deemed to be ethical.
Let's lay down the medical angle at the moment. Are there other professional ethical codes or procedures or ethics that have bearing on this issue?
Lawyers have an ethical duty to fully and fairly represent their clients to the best of their ability, and so the work that Mary and I have been doing over the years certainly involves doing that. Thoroughly reviewing the trials and the records in the case, and in some cases reinvestigating the case. So I've never seen an ethical, there's no conflict for me. I mean, my duty to all my clients is to represent them fully and completely. And personally, I can't imagine a case where that would be more required to do that than in a capital case where someone's life is on the line. So there's certainly no conflict there with those.
And the prosecutorial side, there's no ethical, as long as the lawyers stay within certain bounds, there's no ethical, lawyers are allowed under the people that represent the state. Interestingly, when 20 years or so ago, when John Vanderkamp was the Attorney General of California, he, like my Northville line friend, was personally opposed to the death penalty. And he made it a policy of the Attorney General's office that no lawyer was required to be involved in death penalty cases unless they were unwillingly. In other words, it was not you did not get fired from the Attorney General's office if you were assigned a death penalty case and chose not to do it. Occasionally, there have been district attorneys in California that have followed similar policies, but in general, the death penalty, lawyers have strong views about the death penalty, both on the prosecution side, but on their professional ethics problems.
Well, from professional ethics aside, there are ethics and mores of a country. I come from the European tradition, which evolved capital punishment some time ago, and most of Europe doesn't have it. And that is, in essence, because they've deemed it unethical for their countries to do it. And there are other countries that have that kind of court that have never executed somebody for like 10 years or more, and so they have, in practice, become countries that don't have the death penalty. And I don't know, the numbers for against, but there are many countries that do not think that the ethics and morals of that country sustain death penalty. I don't know the statistic recently, but America is in the top 4 or 5 countries in the world that execute before it gets the body. And the rest are like China, Iran, and North Korea, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq. So, from an ethical point of view, for America in that?
Well, my personal view, I'm opposed to the death penalty. It's a very complex question politically. In the middle 1980s, I spent a year and a half basically working for the British government, and I arrived in England I believe in June of 1983, and there had just been an election in England, and so we had a dispatcher that just was elected. And so prior to that, and so the death penalty was an issue in England. England has basically not had the death penalty since the 1950s or 60s. I don't remember the exact time, but it wasn't. There was substantial support for the death penalty politically in England, and so the promise had been made. I don't know the details of the promise, but that what's called free vote would be allowed in Parliament on the issue of the death penalty. So in the first days of the new Thatcher government, the parliamentary leadership basically there was a debate anymore about the death penalty. So the reports voted, people who were against it. So the polls then were England had not had the death penalty for about 20 or 30 years, but the polls were in the low 50s against and in the high 40s for. And ultimately, the vote in the Parliament was not to reinstate the death penalty. But I mention that simply to say that these are a political issue. These issues exist in some of the other European countries, including Germany and France, where I don't know the current figures, but 20 years ago, even though they're strongly against politically, there was still substantial support for the death penalty among them in polls. And so anyway, I'll stop there. But these are complicated issues at the political level, and recently there's been polling in China, where China is a big death penalty country. The death penalty figures in China are state secret, but there's been polling that's involved some Western experts as well as Chinese, and the Chinese population is about 70% in favor of that. And so some Chinese people I know who are opposed to the death penalty and working against it think that they have one of the struggles that they have to overcome is the political support for the death penalty inside the country.
Oh, well, just briefly, keep saying the same thing in a sense, but the Catholic Church position on this is that all life from conception to natural death is sacred, and all life should be taken in any situation ever. And so, professionally, of course, I would hold that position as well as belief. So that's where we stand. Admittedly, not all Christians, of course, hold that position, and we'll probably look at that in our next question. But I remember debating this with an old pastor who's long dead now. But his point was that any form of life, cat, dog, pig, cow, even animate life, longs to survive, wants to survive. And if you will not impede it, it will fight. And we often see old people, particularly old people, who will fight to stay alive for another year or 6 months. They want to live, they want to stay, and they're prepared to go through a lot of medication and sometimes even pain, operation or whatever. So we would say that urge to live is created by God, and that we should not snuff out life. And in this particular case, the penalty, along with all the addition of problems that occur, but that and there's always the opportunity. We were talking over supper there. Great figures in history have done terrible things and killed. President Casey, David, all occasionally necessary before he was converted and so on. And so people do things. So who is to say that given an opportunity, a person will not have a whole new vision. We sometimes see that. There was a celebrated case there years ago where Texas, unfortunately, President Bush used the judgment in regard to Paula Tucker. But anyway, she was a woman. Carla Tucker, maybe. Anyway, she obviously did that thing, and so on. But she came to great awareness of that, and enormous inspiration in the facility where she was. So there's always the opportunity in all of our lives for repentance, for reevaluation, and whether it's in death penalty or any other situation, people do terrible things, make mistakes, juveniles, a whole area that I've been involved in over the years, juvenile sentencing and so on. Opportunities should be given to people to renew themselves. That's why the death penalty, in addition to everything else, cuts off that opportunity quite prematurely. So there's also reasons why we would be exposed to ethically, spiritually, but also we believe this is a common sense one. No, that's the thing. Not useless at all in society. Might have been actually in some ways, we could make the case maybe in some societies 100 years ago, 500 years ago, you know, just because it was then. You can't judge history like that. Certainly in today's society where Pope John Paul said, there are many other ways to deal with the situation. And one could argue the costs, but even if one were to argue that the costs were greater, and I'm not saying they are, it was greater to keep the person alive than to execute them. That certainly wouldn't be a reason for doing it. But again, that question is
move on. Next question. What constitutes cruel and unusual punishment? And if all humans have inherently been how can successfully administer justice within this practice? Is there a viable alternative to death penalty? Is it a valid term?
I'll make just a brief comment because if you look at national totals in the United States, there have been tremendous swings over the last 20 or 30 years, and so there was a time when the number of the population in favor of the death penalty was 70% or something, or even 75%. In more recent years, because of the exonerations that come about largely because of DNA evidence, and believe that some people who are being executed or who have been convicted have been convicted wrongly. Those figures have come down so that the current numbers, again, these are sort of approximations, maybe others figure better than I, but we're in the low 50s now, at least according to some polls, in terms of favoring the death penalty. The point that I wanted to make that's relevant to your question is that most polls simply say, do you favor, do you oppose the death penalty? Where an alternative is given, in other words, where the alternatives given are favor of the death penalty, favor of life without parole, or opposed to the death penalty. So where you have a three-way poll, the numbers in favoring the death penalty actually drop below 50. Typically in national polls drop below 50%. So the question of alternatives is certainly highly relevant.
I can support that. I know there was a study done in somewhere in the 90s here in California where the numbers were very strong in support of capital punishment, but as the professor is saying, when people were given the alternative of life in prison with no possibility of parole and restitution for victims' families, some sort of compensation for victims' families, support for the death penalty dropped to 26%. So one of the things I found in talking to people is there appears to be fairly broad support for the death penalty, around the 50% level. But the more that people have information about it, learn more about how it works, what the costs are, the effects on victims' family members, the cases of innocence, the exonerations, and the fact that there are, of the DNA exonerations that we know about in this country, when you look at the reasons why someone was wrongfully convicted, where we know we've gotten the wrong person because of the DNA testing that was done, in those DNA cases, 75% of those cases involved mistaken or false eyewitness identifications. So, and another 25% involved false confessions. When people hear those kind of things, you know, if you were on a jury and you knew that someone confessed to a murder, I suspect, like myself, you would feel pretty strongly that they got the right person and that conviction was proper. And yet now we know from having this little window on wrongful conviction involving DNA that there's 25% of those cases where people confess to things they didn't do. And then 75% of them, you had eyewitnesses saying, that's the man, that's the person that did this. I saw him shoot the victim. And it turns out they were wrong. And again, other than a false confession, I can't think of anything more compelling than an eyewitness identification, or perhaps several eyewitness identifications, where several people say that's the person that did it. And yet we know that many times it leads to wrongful conviction. So, you know, I think that has had a big impact. And when the more people know about the death penalty, the less they embrace it. Which is why I have always felt, since I started doing this work, that it was really important to learn more about it and share that information with people, so that when you do have an opportunity to vote, as we did a couple years ago with Prop 34, that you really are fully informed, that you're not just voting based on myths that we assume are true about the death penalty.
I suppose one could also, regarding the question about deterrent, well, I'm not sure that deterrent works very well in any area. Who's going to go out tomorrow to rob a bank and sort of assume they were smarter than anybody else about the bank, they won't get caught, whatever. So that's one thing. One doesn't just sit down and say, oh my gosh, if I rob a bank, I'll get 10 years in jail. I better not do it then. No. And then not to mention all the challenges that people who probably have, obviously it kills them. Many people kill people. But back to what I was saying earlier, about safeness of life, the fact that all life wanted to continue to fight to live. I go out and kill somebody, there's got to be something seriously wrong with me, in the sense of whatever way I was brought up, whatever deficiencies I have. So we're not saying that people who commit kill people are saints, great, are to be in any way honored. That. We would never say that. We would say it's done with the job. We've got to take into account the way people are raised, the whole question of socioeconomic situation comes up many times, and even that ties in with a little bit of what we're saying about addictions. People say that if you're a particular maybe ethnic group, or color, or age, or wealth, or whatever it is, you might have a much better chance of avoiding the thing than somebody who's 22 and a particular socioeconomic group and stuff. So we would just say that for all of that, I just don't think people are going to be able to get this idea. Many challenges they face, problems they have. So the safe thing to do is to not have the death penalty, and all these arguments about deterrent, this, that, justice of crimes. Now, some would also say that actually to be in prison for a long time, and certainly we would maintain that's appropriate. A person should pay what they've done, but they should have a humane situation, be educated, should be healthy, prove themselves, and things should be taken into account. But killing the person is probably useless as a deterrent. It's not necessary for justice, and it does, as we saw at the beginning, probably as much harm to the people who are doing it and to the society as it does good. It doesn't do any good. It makes it just a more violent, nasty society. Somehow we have to overcome these things. Must be restorative justice, forgiveness. Alan John is not the only one who is extremely capable on this side. I have a wonderful friend down in the South End who, she's a police officer in South End and all the life. Her brother was cruelly murdered, and she has fought all her life to oppose the death penalty, as you said. Even though she's in police enforcement, there's be no help to her or to those around her to have the person executed. And so far, she's been able to fight a good fight.
But I rather hesitate to even comment on what constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. Because I'm a lawyer, and this in the end becomes a constitutional question. But I will note that every form of execution that America has had in the past, at one point or another, been regarded as constitutionally okay. So hanging, gas chamber, the electric chair were all at one point or another regarded as not cruel and unusual. But you know, they are lethal injection, and now, of course, there's lots of questions, and in California there's been questions for some time about whether lethal injection is cruel and unusual. So it would seem to me that well, I'd love the lawyers to comment on this. That question is not a fixed one. This is a
yeah, I think many of them have been. Yeah, my feeling is they haven't been declared.
Yeah, well, I was going to address the cruel and unusual punishment question because that's the language from the Constitution of the 8th Amendment, is the ban on cruel and unusual punishment, which kind of shows you how tricky this legal argument is going to be because the founders sure as heck had capital punishment. So when that language was drafted, it was not drafted with the idea that there's that punishment. So this idea that the Constitution mandates the banning of the death penalty involves a pretty interesting philosophy of what the Constitution means for us. And to me, you have to bring in this other idea that often gets thrown around the death penalty, this idea of the evolving standard of human rights, which is the tool that lawyers use to incorporate contemporary and moral understanding into and read it back into the Constitution with the understanding that that's what the founders meant. So that in America, unlike probably, and this explains why the trajectory has been this sort of gradual whittling away of the death penalty rather than the abolition. So that you can argue your case. For example, 10 years ago, they were able to persuade the justices that executing the men was the intellectually disabled. A few years after that, executing children is cruel and unusual. So some of these the litigation on these execution methods involve this idea. But it sort of shows you that if you're going to take a legal approach to this, it will be very surprising to see the death penalty abolished legally. Even when it was abolished in the 70s under Gray versus Georgia, it was only because what the justices wanted to see was better procedures. They wanted to see procedures so that it wasn't like what they called them a lightning strike, so that you couldn't actually tell why a jury had given someone the death penalty when the person right next to them was equally culpable and wasn't. So the state rushed to enact elaborate procedures which they felt would meet the requirements of Gregg and Furman. And ever since then, the sparring has been over whether those procedures are adequate. And it's only been recently that the justices have been once again willing to remove both categories of people from the death penalty, so the known incarnate the juvenile sentence. And I think we might expect to see that a little bit over the next 10, 20 years, but I would be very surprised to see that you can use this language for an unusual revulsion.
Well, and it's political too, because Justice Brennan and Justice Marshall took the position that in every capital case they voted against the death penalty because they found it to be cruel and unusual punishment in all cases. They did find that. They did so consistently. Other justices ruled against the death penalty on constitutional grounds, as Mary was pointing out, for slightly different reasons, that it was arbitrary. They've said it's so arbitrary that you can't predict who's going to be charged with a capital crime or who will be found guilty of a capital crime because the standards were so unclear that your chances of if you kill someone of getting the death penalty were as arbitrary and random as lightning striking. And so some justices have ruled against the death penalty on those grounds. But, you know, theoretically, if you have the majority of the justices who felt as Brennan and Marshall did, then we could have the death penalty declared unconstitutional.
Yeah, there is one justice who's changed his mind about it, Justice Blackman, who's been around who could be written in the book on amendment, 6 amendments to the Constitution. But he was one who changed. He voted with the Gregg majority, and several decades later, he gave up and said, "I won't continue with the machinery." Once again, he determined that it wasn't possible to have the current procedures that would rise to the constitutional level that he thought was required, and so he would have been willing to abandon it. Unfortunately, he gave that up around the time he left the court. So
he was actually Justice Blackman was a conservative. He was an appointee of President Reagan, so he was a Republican presidential appointment. And yeah, as Mary said, voted for 20-some years. Yeah, I don't know how long it went on, but for a long time, always voted for the death penalty. And then right before he retired in a famous case, said he would no longer tinker with the machinery of death. And it was a very long opinion about there's no possible way to deal with this requirement and also deal with this requirement. There were requirements that were constitutionally necessary that actually conflicted with each other, is what he concluded. He just said there's no possible way to make it fair and also consistent, because you're in a death penalty case. What they've interpreted now is that every human being should be dealt with individually, and that it shouldn't be across the board, that you look at that person and see if they deserve the death penalty under these circumstances. So that's the requirement, that you have this right as a human being to this individual determination in your case. And yet at the same time, Justice Blackman pointed out, we also have this requirement that things should be applied fairly across the board, that what's good for you is also good for your neighbor. And that if you do this and your neighbor does it, that you can trust that you're going to get the same punishment. So we said, how can we have it fair and across the board and still have an individual determination? It's impossible. You're asking us to, and that's why he called it tinkering with the machinery of death, because he said, here we are, we're these, human beings sitting on the Supreme Court, and you expect us to do all these machinations to have it come out right. And he just said, I'm washing my hands of this. I'm not doing it anymore. Somebody else can tinker with it. But he basically said this is a bunch of baloney. And you can really see what a bunch of baloney it is when you look at the racial factors of who gets the death penalty. And our country has had a history that was built on racism. In the South, there used to be laws, if you did the same crime and you were white, you got one penalty, and if you were black, you got another penalty. So our country has been built on a system that the unfairness of it was built right into the laws. And I think that's why the South still leads our country in executions, because the South had a history of lynching. And some lives are valued and others are not. And there's really strong statistics about the race of the victim. If you kill a black person versus if you kill a white person, the statistics are just horrendous. Those who kill whites are far, far more likely to get the death penalty than those who kill blacks. And it makes you stop and think about, who do we value in this society? What's important? If one person dies, does it matter if another person dies? It was, I don't know if some of you remember the name, probably not, but Polly Klaas. Older people would remember, because she was a 12-year-old girl who was kidnapped out of her home. She had girls over for a slumber party, and after her parents were in bed, a man broke into the house. We now know Richard Allen Davis was the person who did it, and tied up the girls and kidnapped Polly out of her house, a beautiful 12-year-old girl. Out of Petaluma, in fact. And for about a month, the whole state was looking for Polly Klaas, what happened to her. My child was about the same age at the time, and we were, as parents, everybody was just terrified, thinking, this could have happened to me. And when they finally found her body and captured the guy, there was just no question that that would be a capital case, because it was so high profile. It was a beautiful little white girl stolen out of her home, and this was this depraved guy that probably raped her, and they found her body a month later. And at that time, the suspect, who became the convicted person, Richard Allen Davis, was willing to take a plea bargain where he would plead guilty. In fact, he confessed to the entire crime on videotape. It was all videotaped. And he confessed to it and was willing to take a plea bargain where he would not go to trial, they wouldn't have to prove the case, it would just be done with, and he would get life in prison with no possibility of parole. But they turned that down, you know, as you could say, Jack Rabbit, because there was no way they were ever going to accept that kind of a penalty for him. They wanted blood for blood, and they went to trial. And that trial cost $3.5 million. Just the trial cost $3.5 million. That would have been about 5 times the amount of money that it would have taken to keep him in prison until he died. And he's still in prison. He's never been executed. The case is still going on. Capital cases in this state generally take 20 years or more from the point of conviction until execution. And as we know, you know, executions have been on hold in California for the last 8 years. So, you know, we're still paying to keep him in prison. He's probably getting up there in years. He's probably in his 70s now. And, you know, what have we really gained from it? I know there was an op-ed piece at the time this came out, and the title of the op-ed was, Would Polly Klaas have wanted this? And they talked about the costs. And I later found out that Polly Klaas's mother and her father, so the grandfather, actually wrote to the author of that article and said, you're right, we agree with that. That is not how we would have spent this money. And how much better it would have been if all those millions of dollars could have been put into something that might have actually prevented someone from ending up in that situation. True crime prevention.
If nobody has anything else to say on that, we'll open it up for audience questions. Carrie and
I personally am glad that all of you on the panel have spoken your mind against the death penalty. And I too am against the death penalty. But when we talk with people who are for the death penalty, it seems to be a very difficult, kind of a hit your head against the brick wall a dozen times experience. And when some of our district attorneys like to use the phrase heinous crime and this merits this and on, my question for each one of you is, if you were to have kind of an elevator speech, you're going from the ground floor up to floor 6, what would you say? What would each one of you use as your most compelling argument when you're in an elevator with a person who says, no, I'm for it?
I'm always going to talk, but I'm happy to let someone else.
Well, certainly an element of opportunism in the whole legal system. By saying heinous crimes, lock them up and throw away the key and all that. That's a good way to get myself elected to particular positions. So, try to combat that. But I think the way I would put it is, we live in a world with enormous social debt. That's what John Paul seems like and violence everywhere. And until we somehow are able to realize all the circumstances that cause people to do what they do, the fact that we have to excuse things, but certainly the way you're brought up is different in one place than another. And so we would say that until we all can see life as sacred, then we're just going to continue doing it. And as Alan said there, public class and so on, these people who are pushing this should think about it some more. Be honest with it and see that it's not working, and that it's either based on self-advancement or political gain, or it's based on vengeance, or something that I will feel good if this is done, all of these things. But we know that's not the case. And I wanted to protect my own life, I need to protect the lives of others. And violence, in any case, certainly state violence, without helping, maybe not.
Well, I don't know, because I don't like it, this is an elevator conversation. It's not the kind of thing that really involves changing deeply. I just was thinking, I have tried things. I could try to settle a case, and with the prosecutor, where I tried to persuade him that we were going to spend about, $250,000 in this hearing, and couldn't we get the county and state to come up with a charity fund for a road. And he did. He agreed with me, but he just felt that what had happened was so bad that what my client had done was so horrible. Was murder this little girl in front of another, very brutal way, that it didn't seem to come down to money. So even though we probably could have done a lot better if we could have started it, we still trying to put it in there. I think maybe just taking perspective, taking the long view, is the need blood that's shed isn't discriminated. And maybe if I were on the elevator, I would try to tell the story and get the person to see that when you're on the outside, that when you're not shaken by like this prosecutor, I really liked this man. I thought he was a good prosecutor, a good human being. That when you can see it from the outside, and you're not the one that's been shaken by these emotions, you can take the perspective and give yourself a chance to
I'm going to answer your question in a slightly different way. Comments have already been made about various justices who either historically were against the death penalty or who over time became against the death penalty was a bad thing. The thing that I would come to or would mention with respect to that is whether from one's looking for political ways to change the climate. I think if you look at the history of the death penalty in the United States, politics have already made tremendous changes in the climate. And a lot of some of that's come from moral perspectives, and some of it's come from other perspectives. But in the 1890s, in the 1790s, when this country was very, very young, the Quakers in Pennsylvania discussed abolishing the death penalty. Ultimately, they chose not to do that, but they created a system. The first and second degree murder system that we have today came out of that moral debate by the Quakers, and by creating second degree murder, which did not involve the death penalty. First, that's not the dividing line today, but that creation moved a lot of cases away from the death penalty to some other kind of penalty. And so, in more recent times, first degree is no longer sufficient. One of the results of the actions of the U.S. Supreme Court in the 1970s was that we now have another system with another layer on top. And so, if you look at the long-term trend of the death penalty in the United States, it's gone way down. And so, and you were mentioning earlier the question about mentally ill and the other area where there's been tremendous changes even in the last period is on the juvenile side. So we've gone from not below 15 to not below 7. We're now up to no juvenile. So one of the things that's driving the Supreme Court in this area, one of them also sit around and hope for a miracle and that we'll have 5 justices that would change the equation. But one of the practical areas where there are possibilities for change is that the changes that have come in the last 20 years have come because people in individual states have decided that juvenile have raised the juvenile age in their own state, and then the Supreme Court has come in after the fact, after a lot of states have done that, and sort of ratified, said, okay, now that we have a lot of states, one of the things that moves the court is that if you have a lot of states that are moving in a particular direction, then we'll use that as one of the tools for punishment law. So I think that the trend is in the direction that we're tailing this, and so rather than going for home runs, one strategy is just to keep pushing on particular areas that are particularly egregious and as a way that
well, maybe that's the relevant question. I think it would take 20 years for a reasonably intelligent person to change his mind. It's going to be a long elevator ride. We want to be stuck there. So I don't think you're going to change anyone's mind in the elevator. But I will say, from the point of view of talking to other people about it, I'll quote one of my colleagues. One of my colleagues said, while we may think that we are looking at this from an emotional point of view, if you come to the conclusion, not from a logical point of view, but you come from an emotional point of and no amount of government. And so, you know, if you're stuck in this elevator for 20 years,
Well, I'll say, I think what Mary said is very wise, that, you know, it's just, and everybody's kind of saying that, an elevator ride, you probably can't change a very gut level kind of emotional issue. But I have to say, I always try and to answer your question, Carrie, if I got somebody and it's easy for me to change almost any topic over to the death penalty. That's the way I've been for many years. You know, that reminds me of something I read in the paper this morning. So I do take a lot of opportunities to proselytize because I feel strongly about it. And what I've boiled it down to, I think the top 3 reasons why I would say I oppose the death penalty is, number 1, the strong possibility of executing an innocent person. And I think you have to combine that with the well-known, well-documented, uncontrovertible fact that the death penalty is not a deterrent. And I know when I was 14 years old in high school, I was on a debate team, and I was supposed to debate the pro-death penalty position, and I was all excited because I thought, I know exactly what I'm going to argue. It's going to deter violent crime. And I went to the library back when people went to the library to research things. And I spent all day and found out that it wasn't a deterrent. And I was so crestfallen. And I thought, what is my argument going to be? I can't believe it's not a deterrent. I even went outside of Indiana. I grew up in Indiana. And I went to Michigan and Illinois and California and Texas and researched the entire nation and found nothing to support the deterrent argument, and that still holds true today. So if it's not a deterrent, then you have to say, why do we have it? Because if it were a deterrent, you could say, well, you know, it's gonna stop maybe, you know, 5,000 murders in the whole country this year, and therefore, if we make a few mistakes and a couple people are wrongfully executed, maybe that's the cost of doing business. Sort of like we say with the automobile. We know so many people are going to be killed in car crashes, but the utility of the automobile, we'll never get rid of it. But you can't say that about the death penalty. There's no upside to it. There's only the downside. So I think innocence, the exorbitant cost, and the third thing is that it really doesn't heal victims' family members. I think the victim component is really important for people to keep hearing that, because I mean, I've got stacks of books in here of, you know, murder victims' family members. Here in California, there's another one, a national organization, Murder Victims' Families for Reconciliation, a 5,000-member organization, people who have suffered the worst kind of loss in their lives, and yet they've come to that conclusion that it's a waste. And even I remember a client that Mary and my office represented, William Bonin, was a serial killer out of Orange County known as the Freeway Killer, and he was convicted of murdering 14 teenage boys and probably killed many more than that he was never charged with. And one of the victims' mothers in that case, Sandy Miller, was so much, I mean, she was the spokesperson for those families and wanted to see him dead. After Bonin was executed in 1996, I had a conversation with Sandy Miller, and she admitted to me that it didn't heal her, and that she thought it would, but it didn't, and that the sad thing was that she had to begin the healing process 20 years after Rusty was murdered, after her 14-year-old was raped and murdered. That's when she had, after the execution, when she had, there was nobody else she could throw off all that anger and rage at anymore. He was gone, and now she was left with the same predicament, her poor child gone, and now she had to figure out how she was going to live the rest of her life in some kind of peace when there was no Bonin around anymore to hate and vilify and want dead. And she said publicly in a news magazine that she said she wasn't necessarily opposed to the death penalty, but she wanted people to know that it truly did not heal victims' families the way they were expecting it to. So I think that's an important component. So I would say innocence, cost, and victims' families.
Sir, you to, and at that, we will have to wrap it up.
Just some feedback and then a question. I've tried all those arguments. I don't think I've ever convinced anyone. I'm sure you have read all of the comments in New York Times, other places, even about the Oklahoma. Yes, but I didn't write any letters on that. They have some editorials. All the comments were, this guy got what he had coming. And I wish I would have been there to be more that type of thing. As far as people being innocent, people come back and say, well, maybe of that part. But there's lots of other parts that, you know, and so for the 4, 5, 6% of the innocent, as far as the deterrent, that person will kill. And there's plenty of examples of prisoners who kill.
That's not the definition of deterrent.
Cellmates. So, you know, people kill cellmates, they kill officers, they kill medical personnel, medical personnel, workers, about 6 months ago. The cost, well, if the state would phone me up and actually have that attorneys, so it took 20 years, let them go through the process 4, 5, 6 years, they probably would be cheaper. So I'm just saying, I haven't been successful in those arguments. Maybe just want to talk, or maybe people just want to have you stop talking. So they agree.
Well, I think it depends on who you talk to. There are some people that are on the fence.
I just wanted to get on to something else. And I think that execution is really enshrined at the earliest days, part of the Constitution. I don't think we're going to say it's cruel and unusual, but to be successful in abolishing that. We don't need to convince everybody. Support for the death penalty is pretty steady over the last 63%. You don't have to swing everybody, but you do have to get another 15%.
Question?
Yes, it's really actually something I asked you about, is that 80% of people in this country in this recent Pew research study identify themselves as Christians. And the states where there's the most execution, it's about 92%. So I go back to John Paul, who was able to change 70, 80, 90-year-old people in my parents' opinion on execution by saying the church is against this. And I just wondered your thoughts on working through other Christian faiths with a New Testament kind of approach and getting some type of consensus to swing 15 or 20%, getting some kind of consensus that this is an unchristian thing to do in this country that predominantly identifies itself as Christian. And whether you think that that's a potentially successful strategy. In the same way, I think it's looking at that.
Yeah, the hierarchy of the churches are pretty unanimous against the death penalty, getting people in the pews to go along with the challenge.
The Episcopal Church became formally opposed to the death penalty in 1958. The Lutheran Church in 1990. So, before the Catholic Church, our churches have been officially opposed to the death penalty.
I think we just got to keep on. I wouldn't think too much into the Christian side of it and all those. I think the point of the main area is just keep whittling away at it and hope a good point to make, and we got 15%. Certainly have to get 100%, 90%. But people of goodwill, people of reason, people of faith, just keep presenting it to them, and whether it's John Paul or whether it's the Episcopal Church or any of the other great Christian denominations. Our Jewish friends certainly have very strong views on this. They have been very opposed to that. And I work with Muslim people of all of them. And I still think it's going to be a part of education, part of coming to our senses, part of realizing along the lines that Alan was saying, it really doesn't work
but there's an enormous tendency to think that it will work. It does work. It's a good thing. It's like, God, I'm doing something, you know. But I think we could help people to look at it that way, and think about it, and work through it as this your mother did. The other thing that's very interesting is faiths today are changing all over the place. And a lot of people less spiritually involved in churches, and that doesn't mean it's not spiritual. So just to keep that great, the commandment is there. I guess we feel we can work around it. All this seems to be a very clear thing. Shall not kill. Easy enough to figure out. I've been around a long time too. So let's just keep at it, and of course, even if we don't succeed, to be doing the right thing is in itself a blessing, and to keep encouragement going. Not
I had a few responses to your response, and it was I had three, and one of them was the Gardner case. I believe it was Gardner, where I was now I'm opposed to the death penalty. However, this appeared to be just and unjust at the same time, where it was and where they ended up basically kind of bribing him to give the location of the one girl. So, and they're like, oh, we won't give you death if you do this. Now, if we got rid of the death penalty, what would we do instead? Because then, like, the worst we could do at that point is provide life, and then to say that one person who killed one girl would get death, and one person who killed two, but only reveals the location of one would receive life because they have that one extra thing. That's one of the questions. And another one is like your very beginning argument. I thought that, and perhaps I was mistaken, I thought that the death penalty was there to say that well, you kind of lost your rights since you did this thing that you didn't have the right to do. You don't have the right to kill someone, so we now have the right to I don't know the answer to that. But like with that, I didn't realize that the victim's family, like, emotions about it had any sort of bearing in the law. That was the other thing. Like, what would you have to say about that? Just any of it.
Well, technically, you don't. But don't you think that? I mean, I think that was maybe technically, when you're going through the death penalty, in California, the law is what the victim's family feels about whether or not. But when you think about it from our society's point of view, it does seem like that often an argument is that this is to make the victim whole again. So that point about the victim's family is one of those things.
Oh, and then there's the other one about the first case.
About whether or not if you took death off the table, you wouldn't be able to find victims' bodies. That's the idea. The idea was that because there's this really nasty thing that if you don't cooperate with the prosecution doesn't have that really nasty thing, not as many defendants would cooperate.
Well, I feel like it actually provides a deterrent to, like, that there is a deterrent quality in having it where it might maybe as collateral.
I think it's a negotiating tool.
Yes, what she said. I don't know how to talk.
Well, you mean it's like they're using it as a negotiating tool. We will take the death penalty off the table if you cooperate in some way. And that's for sure. That is a true, I mean, that's why many DAs, district attorneys, don't want to see the death penalty abolished because they consider that one of the tools that they use to get a plea bargain, for example. If you agree to die in prison, we won't take your life otherwise, and some people may agree to do that. There are certainly those arguments that can be made. It's just like some people say to me, would you be against the death penalty if you had absolutely no doubt that this person maybe witnessed it, he confessed to it, all, you know, everything pointed that this was this actual barbaric killer that tortured someone to death, and, you know, wouldn't you be in favor of the death penalty in a case like that? And that's sort of what, kind of what you're saying too, is that there are some things, sometimes, some instances where you would see it as a good thing. And I think that that's probably true. There are instances where you can see it as a positive. But I always come back to, once we say yes to the death penalty, okay, we're going to have it. It is inevitable that it will scoop up the innocent along with the guilty. And we already know there are documented cases where innocent people, there's one, Todd Willingham, young father, was convicted of purposely setting fire to his home and killing his 3 tiny babies inside the house. And at the time of the fire, they had to hold him back and restrain him because he kept wanting to run in to save his babies. I mean, if you were aware of the instant of when they came to the fire, no one would think this was a guy who set his place on fire. It was out of Texas. They did not have good forensic evidence, and the so-called experts that testified said this was started by somebody throwing an accelerant inside and starting the fire. The burn patterns in the house showed that. And so he was convicted, and then he was executed in 2004. He was about 35 years old. He always swore that he was innocent. Now, 10 years after his death, there's been a reinvestigation of it, and the foremost experts in forensic science that know all about burn patterns and the recognized experts have looked at it and said there was no evidence at all in that case that the fire was started by someone throwing an accelerant in. The burn patterns were consistent with, you know, the heat getting to a certain point, blowing out the windows and causing all the oxygen to come streaming in, and it was this heavy burn pattern that looked like, to the untrained eye, an accelerant, but now we know it wasn't. And so, you know, when you see cases like that, where everybody's positive they got the right guy and he did it, and now we know we made a mistake. How do you fix that? So I can't ever endorse the system. There may be many cases where you'd say, who cares? Let him die. You know, he's done a horrible thing. This guy shouldn't walk the planet. But once we say yes to a system that allows us to take a life, and we know we make mistakes, then we're saying yes to murder, state-sanctioned murder.
All right, that's all we have time for. Everybody, thank you. And please
Thank
come to our next successive event.
Thank you.